Truth be told, certain weird Old West facts could make you cringe in absolute disgust. Get ready to drop your jaws, puke, and squeeze your nose as you hear of the top 10 Old West facts that are top-tier disgusting. 10. These folks were obsessed with spitting if you were in the Old West. There is a 99.9% chance that the most common sound you would hear for a whole day would be hawk-twa. Everywhere you go, you would see people forcefully gathering up smelly phlegm from behind their throats and spitting it out directly on walls, floors, or probably at you. You see, this rather disgusting practice of spitting was due to a habit which was popular back then: chewing tobacco. In the Old West, many people chewed tobacco instead of smoking it. This was partly because chewing was easier, when you couldn't always find matches or a place to light up. Chewing tobacco creates a lot of juices in the mouth, which people spit out. This led to the widespread use of spittoons, small containers placed in homes, saloons, and even on sidewalks, to catch the spit. The sound of tobacco juice hitting a spittoon was as common as the clink of glass in a saloon. In addition to their strange tobacco addiction, spitting could also be a sign of disapproval. It was seen as tough, masculine behavior, and men often used it to show they were part of the frontier lifestyle, like saying, "Hey dude, I'm the boss here. I make the orders. Here is one unworthy shot of saliva on your face." Sometimes, the way a person spits could even send a message, like showing impatience without saying a word. However, spitting wasn't just a harmless habit. It contributed to public health problems, like the spread of tuberculosis, a serious lung disease. Streets and floors often became dirty and sticky with tobacco spit, creating unpleasant and unhygienic conditions. Some towns tried to ban public spitting, but old habits were hard to break, and these rules weren't always enforced. Over time, spitting became less common. As people learned more about the spread of diseases, there was a push to improve public hygiene. Smoking became more popular than chewing tobacco, partly because matches became more available and it was easier to light up a cigarette. This shift, along with a better understanding of health risks, led to a decline in the habit of spitting. Number 9. Communal towels were used to wipe off beer foam, like it couldn't get any grosser. Imagine going to a bar to cool off with some beer and getting your mustache stained with so much foam. Then you signal to the barman to help you with some tissue to clean off. However, instead of a clean piece of tissue, the barman passes you a brown towel reeking with the smell of alcohol and saliva from a man who hasn't used a toothbrush in decades. Yes, that was the reality of the Old West. You see, saloons were the social centers of towns in the Old West, where people gathered to relax, share news, and enjoy a drink. The atmosphere was often rowdy and energetic, with patrons seeking a break from the hard realities of frontier life. Given the limited water supply and the general harshness of the environment, keeping things clean was challenging. In the late 19th century, disposable paper towels were unheard of. Instead, saloons used communal towels, typically hung by the bar. These towels had multiple uses, from wiping sweat and grime to drying hands. However, one of their main purposes was to deal with the foam that topped off freshly poured beer. Without refrigeration, beer in the Old West was often served warm, producing a lot of foam. To make drinking easier, patrons would grab the communal towel and wipe off the excess foam from their mugs. This simple act was a practical solution to a common problem, reflecting the resourcefulness of people living in that time. Looking back, the use of communal towels seems far from sanitary. These towels needed to be cleaned regularly, accumulating sweat, dirt, and beer residue. The concept of germs was not well understood then, and such practices likely contributed to the spreading illnesses. Yet, for the people of that era, this was just a part of daily life, and unfortunately, some people would go home with a drunken belly, plus a free communicable disease. Using communal towels speaks to a broader way of life in the Old West. People often shared resources out of necessity, from water to tools to towels. Personal hygiene was a low priority, and the communal use of items was standard. Today, using a communal towel in public seems strange, thanks to modern hygiene standards and a better understanding of health. This practice from the Old West offers a fascinating glimpse into the everyday realities of the time. Number 8, outhouses, the stinky and buggy reality of frontier life. In the Old West, outhouses were a fact of life, an essential yet unpleasant part of daily living. These simple wooden structures, perched over a pit in the ground, were the primary means of sanitation for many frontier families. While practical, they were far from a pleasant experience. The most notorious feature of outhouses was their overpowering smell. Imagine a small enclosed space filled with human waste and wood, an aroma strong enough to make even the toughest cowboy wince. People tried to combat the stench by adding lye or lime to the pit, but these substances only offered a faint masking effect. The result was a chemical-laden scent, mingling with the natural odors, creating a fragrance that was anything but pleasant. As if the smell weren't bad enough, outhouses were magnets for insects, especially flies. These unwelcome visitors swarmed around, drawn by the waste. Flies added to the discomfort and posed health risks, as they could easily spread bacteria and diseases. But the horror didn't stop with flies. The dark, secluded spaces of outhouses were prime real estate for black widow spiders. These venomous spiders often made their homes in the corners and under the seats of outhouses, turning a simple bathroom trip into a potentially dangerous encounter. The thought of sitting down next to a hidden spider made every visit a nerve-wracking experience. Despite their many downsides, outhouses were a necessary part of life in the Old West. Indoor plumbing was a luxury few could afford, so outhouses were the best option available. They provided a straightforward solution for waste disposal, even with significant drawbacks. People developed creative ways to deal with the discomfort and dangers of using outhouses. Some kept sticks handy to clear away spider webs before sitting down, while others might have used perfumed handkerchiefs to mask the smell. In some places, more elaborate outhouses with better ventilation or multiple seats were built, offering a slight improvement in comfort. Number 7. A good night's sleep turned terrible due to seam squirrels. Now, picture yourself settling down to sleep after a long day. Instead of a soft mattress, you're lying on a bed filled with straw and hay. It might sound charmingly rustic, but the reality was far less idyllic, especially considering the unwelcome bedfellows known as seam squirrels. In the Old West, comfort was a luxury few could afford. Beds were basic, often just frames filled with straw or hay. While these materials were plentiful and cheap, they weren't exactly cozy. Worse, they rarely got changed or cleaned, turning them into prime real estate for various pests. Enter the seam squirrels, a quaint name for a not-so-quaint problem, lice. These tiny critters loved the warmth and darkness of straw beds, and had a particular fondness for hiding in the seams of clothing and bedding. These lice would emerge when folks lay down to rest at night, causing relentless itching and discomfort. It's no wonder sleep was often hard to come by. Lice were just the tip of the iceberg. The Old West was teeming with bugs. Flies were a constant nuisance, drawn to the abundant food scraps and less than sanitary living conditions. These pesky insects would buzz around homes, spreading germs and making life even more uncomfortable. And then there were the mosquitoes. Without modern conveniences like window screens, these bloodsuckers had free rein to invade homes, especially on warm nights. Their bites left itchy welts, and could spread diseases, adding another layer of misery to life on the frontier. Like Rose Pender in the late 1800s, visitors to the Old West often commented on the bug problem. Pender famously remarked, "Bugs abounded, so I got very little rest," a sentiment likely shared by many. With insects freely moving between homes and outhouses, they left all sorts of unpleasantness behind, thanks to the lack of window screens. Living with pests was a daily challenge. Back then, people needed to fully understand hygiene and disease prevention. The concept of germs was still relatively new, and many lacked the means to maintain clean living conditions. As a result, infestations of lice, flies, and mosquitoes were all too common. Despite this, folks in the Old West found ways to cope. Some sprinkled strong-smelling herbs like lavender or mint in their beds, hoping to repel insects. While only partially effective, this was a popular method to keep the pests at bay. Others shook out their bedding regularly, trying to dislodge any unwelcome guests. Bed frames were sometimes elevated off the ground to reduce pest invasions, though this was only marginally successful against the persistent lice and mosquitoes. The prevalence of pests, like seam squirrels, wasn't just a nuisance. It had serious health implications. Constant scratching from lice bites could lead to infections, while the presence of flies and mosquitoes increases the risk of disease. The lack of sanitation and understanding of hygiene contributed to a tough and often unhealthy lifestyle. Number 6. Getting clean water was super challenging. In the Old West, finding clean water was more challenging than shooting straight after a night at the saloon. Settlers, cowboys, and pioneers faced the same problem: getting water that wouldn't leave them running to the outhouse. Streams, wells, and rivers were the primary sources, but these were often more contaminated than the punchline of a cowboy joke. The problem started upstream. Quite literally, rivers and streams were frequently used as dumping grounds for human and animal waste. Townsfolk and travelers contributed to the mess, tossing in everything from leftovers to laundry and even chamber pots. Imagine a place where your water's flavor profile could include a hint of dirty socks, a splash of horse manure, and a dash of mystery sludge. Awfully delicious. Wells, the supposed bastions of clean water, were similar. Many were poorly constructed, easily contaminated by surface runoff, or located too close to the local outhouse. This proximity turned the act of drawing water into a game of, "What did I just drink?" The luckiest souls ended up with only slightly brackish water, while the less fortunate ones had a daily rendezvous with dysentery. In an attempt to tackle the water problem, some folks got creative. Boiling water was a common practice, but who had the energy to make a pot of cowboy tea in the heat of the West? Others tried filtering water through cloth or sand, but this was about as effective as using a cheese grater to keep out mosquitoes. Charcoal filters were another option, but they were more likely to end up in a campfire than in a water purification system. Given the dire state of water, it's no wonder alcohol became the beverage of choice. Beer, whiskey, and other spirits were safer to drink than water, though with their problems. It's hard to imagine the Old West without its iconic saloons. But the truth is, they were often the safest places to get a drink, just not of water. This practice led to a cultural norm where it was more acceptable to be drunk than to be sick from bad water. 5. They had weirdly gross hygiene practices. In the Old West, personal hygiene was less about cleanliness and more about survival. Without reliable access to clean water, keeping oneself clean was a daily battle that often resulted in more grime than glory. Public bathhouses were available in some towns, offering a communal tub experience where you could soak in water that had already embraced the filth of previous bathers. Sharing bathwater with strangers was a gamble. Think of it as a human soup, where you never knew what flavors had been added before you. The dry bath was popular for those living on the frontier or out on cattle drive. This involved thoroughly dusting with whatever was handy, usually dirt or ash, to absorb sweat and mask odors. It's like using dry shampoo, but with fewer modern conveniences and more potential for looking like a chimney sweep. Cowboys in particular would often go weeks without a proper wash, resulting in a unique blend of body odors that probably didn't make them the most popular guests at social gatherings. On the other hand, women still maintained the decency of washing at least their face, arms, and legs to look relatively clean. Menstrual hygiene was particularly challenging in women's lives in the Old West. Disposable sanitary products didn't exist, and commercial options were limited. Women often used homemade cloth pads, which were washed and reused. These pads were usually secured with belts or safety pins, neither comfortable nor reliable. In more rural frontier areas, women might use natural materials like moss or grasses, though these could have been better. The lack of privacy and proper sanitation facilities made managing menstruation discreetly a constant struggle. Despite the discomfort and inconvenience, women were often expected to carry on with their daily chores without complaint. Every menstrual period would have been a nightmare. Dental hygiene was another area where the Old West showed its rough edges. Toothbrushes were rare, and toothpaste was an even rarer luxury. Instead, people used twigs or cloths to clean their teeth, often with limited success. Tooth decay and gum disease were rampant, creating a landscape filled with toothless grins and makeshift dentures. Dentistry was a rudimentary affair, usually involving a blacksmith or barber yanking out teeth with pliers. Anesthesia? That was what whiskey was for, though it was more about numbing the courage than the pain. So when next you go to your barber, imagine him as a dentist with a plier. In an era before deodorant, people had to get creative. Some used herbal concoctions or sprinkled themselves with powders to absorb sweat and mask odors. Wealthier folks might import perfumes from the East, while others relied on nature's air conditioning, which included open windows and the great outdoors. Number 4. Mercury was the magic cure for syphilis. Mercury, also known as quicksilver, had been a part of medical practices long before the Old West came into being. By the 19th century, it was the go-to treatment for syphilis, a sexually transmitted infection that was as rampant as it was feared. The logic, with its unique properties, mercury was believed to cleanse the body of impurities, including the dreaded syphilis bacterium. In reality, the treatment was often worse than the disease. Doctors prescribed mercury in various forms, ointments, pills, and steam baths. One popular method involved rubbing mercury-laden ointment on the skin, humorously called injunction. The idea was simple. If the mercury could penetrate the skin, it could reach and eradicate the syphilis lurking within. The reality? Patients often end up with mercury poisoning, complete with symptoms like drooling, severe mouth ulcers, and loss of teeth. A condition known as mercurial tilism. Talk about a cure that's hard to swallow. Despite the severe side effects, mercury treatment persisted for centuries, largely because it did offer some temporary relief from syphilis symptoms. The problem was that the relief often came with a heavy cost. Patients would lose their teeth, suffer from severe gastrointestinal issues, and endure neurological problems, all for a fleeting improvement in their condition. In a grim irony, the mercury treatment sometimes proved more deadly than the syphilis it was meant to cure. Looking back, it's easy to chuckle at the absurdity of using such a toxic substance as a cure. The Old West was a time of many medical missteps, where the line between healer and harm-doer was often blurry. Today, we know better, thanks to medical advances and a deeper understanding of syphilis and mercury. Modern antibiotics have replaced the crude and dangerous remedies of the past, offering real cures without the need for such extreme measures. There was dust everywhere in the Old West. Dust wasn't just an annoyance, but a constant companion. You couldn't escape it in a dusty town or on the open plains. Dust got into everything, from clothes to food, making life in the Old West a gritty experience. Imagine waking up to find fine dust covering everything in your room. That was a typical morning for people in the Old West. Dust clouds kicked up from the ground with every step and every gust of wind. It was everywhere, and there was no escaping it. Clothing had to be practical because of all the dust. Bandanas weren't just for looking cool. They were essential for covering your face to avoid inhaling dirt. Hats served double duty, keeping the sun off your face and helping to keep dust out of your eyes. Of course, these hats often became dust magnets, but they were better than nothing. All this dust wasn't just unpleasant and bad for your health. People often had respiratory problems from breathing in so much dust. Lung fever was a common term for these issues, which were often serious and sometimes fatal. Living in a dusty environment was hard on the lungs and could lead to long-term health problems. Even after death, the dust was still a problem. Shallow graves often meant that wind would expose the remains, turning graveyards into another dusty scene. The phrase, "dust to dust," was more than just a saying. It was a reality. Despite all the challenges, people in the Old West kept their sense of humor. They joked about how you needed a dust mask more than clean clothes, and laughed at the impossibility of keeping anything clean. This humor was a way to cope with the tough conditions they faced every day. Number 2. Live shows were a dangerous gathering of germs. While audiences were captivated by thrilling performances, they were also unwittingly partaking in a less glamorous exchange of microbes. Imagine a crowded saloon, packed to the rafters with people who haven't seen a soap bar in weeks, if not months. Cowboys fresh off the trail, miners covered in a thin layer of grime, and townsfolk who've had more close encounters with cattle than clean water. It was a melting pot of germs, a veritable petri dish of human filth, where every cough, sneeze, and handshake could be the precursor to a full-blown epidemic. In an era where personal space was as foreign a concept as antibiotics, folks packed into these venues like sardines in a can. Theaters and saloons were hotbeds for the spread of all manner of delightful illnesses. Common colds. Oh, those were the least of their worries. Tuberculosis was a frequent visitor, and it didn't bother knocking. With a persistent cough here and a hacking sneeze there, it was like a grim symphony of the unwell. People back then didn't just cough politely into their elbows. No, they hacked and spat with reckless abandon, often aiming for a communal spittoon, but frequently missing. This led to a delightful layer of bodily fluids on the floor, which patrons trudged through, unknowingly collecting an array of pathogens on their boots and hems. Refreshments during these live shows didn't help matters. Food and drinks were served in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint. Communal mugs were the norm, and washing them properly was more of a suggestion than a practice. A quick rinse in tepid water did little to dislodge the film of grease, grime, and you guessed it, germs. When you grabbed a drink, you got a bit of everyone else who had used that cup before you. A sip of beer came with a side of Mr. Johnson's lingering cold and Mrs. O'Leary's persistent flu. It was the Old West's version of Russian roulette with microbes. And let's remember the performers themselves. Traveling troops moved from town to town, bringing entertainment and germs wherever they went. They were like the original social media influencers, spreading the latest trends and the latest strains of influenza. These performers often lived in close quarters, traveling together in cramped wagons, and had about as much opportunity to bathe as a cactus in the desert. They didn't just bring their talent when they took to the stage. They generously shared their coughs, sneezes, and sweat with the audience. Their rarely washed costumes were likely more bacteria-ridden than a modern-day biohazard suit. After the shows, as people staggered home, They didn't just carry the memories of a thrilling performance. They took home a bounty of germs, ready to be shared with family and friends. Small towns could quickly turn into hotbeds of illness after a particularly well-attended show. The flu spread like wildfire, killing entire communities faster than a gunslinger's draw. Finally, at number 1, public executions were more like a big show. The Old West is famous for its wild adventures and tough characters, but it also had a darker side. Public executions, hangings, were not just about justice. They were major events in town, attracting crowds like a big show. But these hangings weren't always straightforward, often becoming unexpectedly humorous, albeit in a grim way. In the Old West, justice was swift and sometimes quite public. When the local sheriff caught an outlaw, the townspeople expected a good old-fashioned hanging. These events drew crowds as if they were the county fair. Men, women, and children gathered in the town square, eager for the show. After all, hanging was prime entertainment in a time without Netflix. However, these public executions were not always the seamless, neck-snapping affairs they were supposed to be. Imagine the scene: a tense crowd, a somber sheriff, and a condemned man with a sack over his head, bravely or foolishly awaiting his fate. The executioner would pull the lever and snap, or rather, sometimes thud. You see, hangings could go horribly wrong in several ways. If the drop was too short, the unfortunate soul would slowly strangle, feet twitching in a macabre dance. If the drop was too long, well, let's say decapitation was an occupational hazard. There are records of gallows malfunctioning, with the condemned bouncing back up like a gruesome jack-in-the-box. Imagine explaining that to the kids. Well, Timmy, sometimes justice needs a little fine-tuning. Over time, these execution sites took on a gruesome appearance. The ground beneath the gallows, repeatedly soaked with the bodily fluids of the executed, turned into a muddy, foul-smelling quagmire. The gallows themselves, stained and weather-beaten, stood as a macabre reminder of frontier justice. It wasn't uncommon for birds to roost on the gallows, picking at whatever grisly morsels remained. Children, ever curious, would dare each other to approach the eerie structure at night, often claiming to hear the ghostly creaks and groans of past hangings. That's all for today's video. Kindly give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more videos. Thanks for watching.